Thanks, Andy, and welcome everybody. Glad to have some folks here this morning to talk about estimation. A little bit about myself before we get started. I am a senior director of digital experience platforms at a company called Bounteous. I've been working in the Drupal space and with Bounteous since 2009, and my team, really focuses on Drupal. I have a lot of interests: astronomy, baseball, reading many books, and doing large jigsaw puzzles. This whole thing is a little bit new to me. So I have a couple of young kids and a cat. Not usually present when I give presentations, so there may be a special guest appearance. A little bit about Bounteous. We were formed in 2003 in Chicago. We work with lots of great clients, and we have lots of great people that work for us, including an amazing Drupal team. We do a lot more than Drupal. We do strategy, experience design, analytics and insight, marketing, and more. So if you'd like to talk to me about what we do and how we do it, I'd be happy to talk to you. So the agenda today to talk about estimation is this. I'm going to break it down into just talking a little bit about some basics about estimation to make sure we're on the same page, so to speak. I'll talk about some of the different approaches I use to do estimation, and then probably most importantly, talk about some of the principles that I follow when I'm doing estimation. I should have probably 10 or so minutes for questions at the end. So I'll have Andy read them to me at the end. So please, fire away in the chat as you will. So let's talk about estimation. The first thing to do is to have a definition that we agree to. So I pulled this one from Oxford Online, and it goes that an estimate is an approximate calculation or judgment of the value, number, quantity, or extent of something. And if you read the definition a little further, it goes on to say that it's also a written statement indicating the likely price that will be charged for a specified work or repairs. So this is a lot of what I do on a daily basis. I'm often evaluating projects, both SSO opportunities and new business, responding to RFPs and things of that nature. And this is what I do. I help create written statements that tell you how much it's going to cost to do something. I like that that definition also has likely in there, because anyone that's done a lot of estimating knows that it's really hard, and it's really hard to nail the number exactly. So we'll come back to this point over and over again, I think, during the conversation. And while I spend a lot of my day, doing project estimation, especially at the beginning when there's less information involved, a lot of what I talk about today will apply to you no matter if your something is a task, a feature, or a project. So we estimate every day, even though we don't really think about it in these terms. And I do it a lot. If I need to go somewhere, I ask, when will I arrive? Your scrum master, your boss might ask you when a certain task will be done by. My kids love to ask me when I'm going to have dinner ready. I often ask myself how far I can go before running out of gas. And so far, fortunately, only ran out once. If I think about the when will I arrive part of this, I spend a lot of time going to Chicago into our offices. I live up here in Green Bay. And so I often have to plan out those trips, right? And so if you think about it in terms of estimation, it's what I'm doing. First thing I do is I think about how long it's going to take me to get to Chicago, assuming that there's no problems, right? And so roughly that's about a 3-hour and 15-minute trip for me. And then I start to think, hey, when am I going to leave Green Bay? Because if I leave Green Bay at the wrong time, I'm going to hit traffic in Milwaukee and Chicago, which is going to lengthen that trip. I may need to get gas on the way, so I need to incorporate those types of things. Maybe I want to grab some breakfast if it's really early morning and before I want to eat before I leave. So there are lots of these things that we kind of incorporate into what we do every day, and ultimately I arrive when I need to arrive. If I need to make sure I arrive by a certain time, then I'm going to bias my estimate a bit, right? I'm going to make sure I overestimate how long things are going to take as opposed to underestimate them. So these are some of the techniques that I use daily, and we'll go through them as we go. Before talking about those techniques and some more questions you should ask yourself, I like to think about what an estimate is not. So an estimate is not a guess. Anyone familiar with the term swag that's in my title? It's, I put that in there, tongue firmly planted in cheek. A swag stands for a silly, wild ass guess. And it's not what we do. We're really smart people. We've done this for a long time. We have lots of history to fall back onto. Our estimates are really educated by our experience and by our data, hopefully more data than experience. But definitely, we're just not picking out numbers out of thin air. An estimate is also not a plan. Now, I talked about my trip a bit, and it's true that it's part of a plan, or a plan can be part of what you do for an estimate. But ultimately, the first thing we do when we're doing an estimate and when we're thinking about a problem is we're really trying to figure out how long it's going to take us to do this, regardless of the other extraneous details. And so, as we talk about it a little bit later, I'll talk about how I use a plan to kind of help shape my estimate as well. But they're definitely not one and the same. And an estimate should not be static. And this one, I think oftentimes people, kind of fall back to it as being a static thing. If you're in the same position that I am and you're making estimates at the beginning of a project, like to respond to an RFP, there are many things that I don't know when I make that estimate. And so if we just blindly follow that estimate without updating it as we go along and as we learn more things, it's going to become wildly inaccurate. So when you prepare to do your estimates, and when I prepare to do my estimates, I often ask myself, a number of questions. One of the first things I want to know when I'm doing an estimate is, what precision do I have in order for this thing to be considered accurate? If you think about what accuracy means, that's whether or not it actually hit the target. Okay. And precision is the range around that number that I get to hit and still be considered accurate. If you think about it in these terms, if I gave you a project and you estimated it to take a year, and it actually took 13 months, would we consider that to be accurate? If we had a project and we estimated it to be $1 million and it came in at $1.2 million, is that accurate? And the answer is it kind of depends, right? It depends on what the precision is. Although I'd say for both of those, estimates, especially if they were really early on in the project, I'd consider those smashing successes. I also want to know, how confident do I need to be in the estimate? What's kind of at stake if we get this wrong and, we get it wildly wrong? And what happens if we go over the budget or, past the timeline or those types of things? Depending on how confident I need to be in the estimate, that might kind of inform the next question, which is what direction should the error be made in? If we think about my example of driving to Chicago and I wanting to be there at a certain time, I make sure all of the errors are overestimates, right? And so I think it's going to take me 3 hours and 15 minutes, but I assume I'm going to run into like 30 minutes of traffic. And I assume that there's, I'm going to take a pit stop and it's going to take me 30 minutes, right? And so I'll leave, my house, 4 hours and 15 minutes early. And if I end up being early, that's great. I just don't want to be late, and that's the type of thing that we want to know here. It's also important to know what question the estimate's helping to answer. So when somebody asks you to do an estimate, they have an idea in mind of what they really want to know. Now, oftentimes this is how much will this cost or how long will this take, and we're all really used to doing those types of, answering those types of questions. Sometimes it can be, can or should we do this project, right? So if I come up with this estimate and I hand it off to the person, they might be just using that to evaluate whether it's, valuable to the project. If, it's going to cost me $500,000 and we expect to, generate, $500 of revenue every quarter from that, it's probably not a worthwhile project, right? And so, those are some of the things that we can do, and some of the questions we might want to answer. We also recently had an example where a client came to us and wanted a number of things fixed, and they had a pretty tight deadline. And so the question wasn't how much is this going to cost or how long will this take? It was how much can you fit in this time frame? right? Which is a different, a different level of estimate as well. Um, Kind of thinking beyond the estimate and maybe more the solutioning part, there's a few more questions we can ask ourselves. What kind of mac and cheese are we really making here? Is it store brand? Is it craft? Is it gourmet? And all this to say that, if I'm working on a solution for a high-end fashion agency, and this is going to be a really public website, uh, I'm probably going to make this thing gourmet. Like that's how I'm going to bias the solution, which then will impact my estimate. But if I'm working with maybe a startup or someone that has a really, really tight budget, we're going to lean towards the store brand, and we're going to make this really practical and get it working, as quickly as we can. So those are, some questions you want to ask yourself. In my case, I often ask myself whether or not this is new business. And if it is new business, is this fixed bid or T&M? Time and materials, right? If it's fixed bid, it'll go back to that question of how I'm going to bias the errors, right? I'm going to bias the errors to be overestimates because we're taking on 100% of the risk if it goes over. I also think about whether or not this is an existing client or a new client. And if it's an existing client, what do I know about the client? What do I know about, their desire for, how fancy the solution should be, or, are they really, really tight on timeline and budget, or are they more roll with it, then let's get the right solution, or, what kind of client am I dealing with? And all these things help shape the solution, which then impacts, the estimate that I do. So when and how often should you estimate is also something you should be thinking about as you do your projects. What you're looking at on this page is the called the cone of uncertainty, and I got familiar with it from a book by Steve McConnell, which I'll reference a little bit later. But the idea here is that on the left side of the screen is the very beginning of the project. We've come up with an idea for a project. We've thought through it a little bit, and we've come up with an estimate. And as we go right, we're going through stages of the project to define it better and whatnot. And then we get to the build, and then we continue right until finally the upper and lower ranges meet on the timeline, and that's when the project's done. So as you think about this, it makes a lot of sense, right? The more we do in the project, the more we learn about the project, the more we understand the requirements and maybe what the unsaid requirements were, the more we understand how the client's going to work. All these types of things bring more clarity to what we're doing. We understand the team better, we understand how it works and how efficient it is. All those types of things are going to let us narrow the range that we think that this project's going to hit. And ultimately, when we're done, we'll know how long it'll take. On the left side, just to give some perspective though, when we really just initially think about the project, McConnell suggests that the range is 0.25x to 4x, right? So if I think the project is ultimately going to take 1,000 hours and somebody asks me at that point how long I think it's going to take, if I want to be right 90% of the time, I'm going to tell them 250 to 4,000 hours, right? It's a crazy big spread, I know, and we often can't do that. But ultimately, if we want 90% accuracy, at that early stage, that's what we're really talking about. So a fun fact before we go into estimation approaches, we only know a project's cost or length with 100% certainty when it is complete, right? Often we express, confidence in our estimates, and we're surprised when they go over or they go under or whatnot. But ultimately, really the only time we know 100% certain when things, how much it's going to cost or when it's going to be done is when we're done with it. So let's talk about some of these different estimation approaches that I use anyway. My go-to method really for doing these estimations is something I'll call comparison-based estimation. And the idea here is we take whatever project that we're thinking about and we try to compare it to something we've already done. And hopefully we've done a lot of different projects, so we have lots of things to compare to, because ultimately what we want to do is find out how is this project alike those projects? How does it differ, right? And I'm thinking in terms of, size and complexity really. And, do we have anything that's really comparable? If we don't have something that's, comparable per se, we can often stack projects together. So the project I'm looking at is like 2 of those projects or like 3 of those projects to get our comparison-based estimate. The more experience you have and the more data you have, the better this is going to work. It's I think pretty obvious. But like if your entire world has been building one brochure or site and then something like Amazon.com, and I give you a third project, it's going to be really hard for you to compare this project to those 2 things. Likely, it's going to be more towards the brochureware than Amazon.com. And we want data. The more data we have, the better off we're going to be. One of the things that's really important, though, is that we really need to know the actual data from the projects that we're comparing to. And this is important because if we don't, we're going to introduce error into our estimates. So if you think about an example where you compare this project to another project, and that other project you estimated to take 1,500 hours, and you say, yep, this is exactly like that one, right? And you go with the 1,500 hours. What happens if the other project actually took 2,000 hours to complete? You've just introduced 33% error into your estimate. And you also need to make sure that that data is accurate. As a consultant, we're constantly logging our time. I'm constantly logging my time and bucketing hours and all that good stuff. That's really important. But like if you work for a company and you're building your own Drupal website, do you have time tracking? And if you have time tracking and you work for salary, do you bother to put in more than 40 hours? Right? So if somebody's actually working 50 hours a week on that project you're comparing to, but they only put in 40, that's a 25% error that goes in there. I find that this is a pretty good method for doing quick estimates. Accuracy can be lacking, right? Because it's comparing big projects to big projects. But I often use this early on in our process when we're evaluating whether we want to respond to an RFP or like what we think the likely outcomes are for us. But if I want to be more accurate with this, I'm going to use this with decomposition. And so the larger the project is, the harder it is to compare to other projects because there's so many differences in between the 2 projects. And so often what we can do is break down those projects into smaller chunks and then start to compare the chunks, and that'll give us a better idea of what we think about how this will work. Now, there's a number of different ways you can break down, and decompose a project. You can do it by project phase, right? So you can do it with, discover, conceive, or build. You can even break it down into different activities like requirements gathering, things like that. I tend not to do this because it's kind of hard for me to understand when one phase ends and another begins. If you have a requirements gathering phase that you've estimated or you're comparing, and we all know that we typically find the missed requirements, in the 11th hour when we're running up against it during the build, right? And so where do I allocate that time to? A lot of times, our clients want us to hit certain timeline deadlines with our projects, and so often we'll overlap conceive and build, and so it's hard to maybe pull those numbers apart. We can also do it by components, and when I say components, I'm really not talking about like a hero banner or a quote. What I'm really talking about is like a distinct part of the system, like an order entry system or an inventory system. And again, this isn't one I tend to do a lot because oftentimes when we do this and we compare these parts, we miss the glue or the interconnectivity that make these systems work, right? So if I'm thinking about the order entry system and it needs to tie into the inventory system, which one of those buckets gets the time to make that interconnectivity work? What I typically do is do this by functionality. You can think about these as big user stories or maybe epics. And what I like to do with those things is I like to make sure that they cross big swaths of the system. So I make sure I incorporate all that glue that I need to do in there. I think, the big stories are really good for estimating entire projects, but if we're working in a sprint, per se, we can start breaking those things down. And oftentimes we do, using a planning poker and things of that nature. To take decomposition a bit further, there's a technique called bottoms up. And it's, like the comparison-based decomposition, but just goes much, much deeper. And again, this project or this method works by breaking the project down into features and tasks, and to give us a much better idea of what it'll take to do this project. We talked about the big project being harder to estimate, but one of the things that also brings into focus is the fact that if I make an error when I'm doing the estimation, it's going to be either high or low, and there's like no in between really, right? Whereas if I decompose the project into all of its features and tasks, I'm essentially estimating many, many smaller features, and typically there are going to be errors on both sides. There's going to be some overestimation, there's going to be some underestimation, and these will tend to balance each other out. And what this does is it gives us a more accurate estimate. Now, the one thing I would caution you is that you don't want to get fixated on any of these individual parts. And what I mean by that is when I go and I've done my estimation and I give the number, oftentimes I'm told, ooh, yeah, it's a bit high, right? And then somebody very helpfully goes through my estimate line by line, and they pick up the things that they think are overestimated, right? And what this does is if you just change those numbers and presumably drop them lower, what it does is it gives you're left with anything that is accurately estimated or underestimated, because when someone seems to think the project's overestimated, they don't care about the things that are underestimated. And now we're left with a more inaccurate estimate, and it's also underestimated. And we as developers are happy path people, right? And so our estimates tend to be underestimates anyway. So we definitely don't want that help, if you will. Another method that is often overlooked is just to count stuff. So there are a lot of things that we do on a project, lots of things that we can count that correlate with time and effort, right? And so, there's user stories and requirements and defects, there's story points, and lots of things that we do, right, on a daily basis. We also, in Drupal projects, have a lot of other things that we can count. We can count, content types and components and taxonomies. We can count, contrib modules that we're using, or custom modules that we have to build, like those types of things. And all these things really, at some level, will correlate to how long a project takes. If you're going to use count stuff, it does better if it's more than just a few things, right? And the more is better up to a point. Again, I've said it before, and I'll keep saying it. We want historical data for previous projects that we can use, right? So when we count a bunch of things, we want to be able to look at and say, hey, in the past, a content type takes us 20 hours to build, or a small component takes us 4 hours to build, or whatever it is, right? Because what ultimately we want to do is take those things that we've counted and we want to multiply them out and give us our estimate. Whatever we're counting should be consistent from project to project. So if you think a small component on one project is a cool component, and on the other is an insane Google map with a bunch of integrations, right? There's going to be a problem there. So we just want to make sure that we're consistent from project to project. And I find that this is a pretty good method to use on any stage of the project. And it's not as detailed as, say, like a bottoms up, so it may not have the same accuracy, but it can give you a pretty good rough idea of what's going on. And even to the point where I know some project teams have, instead of using story points and planning poker, just counted the user stories after a while, because what they found is that they're consistently delivering the same number of stories every sprint. Another way we can break things down is t-shirt size by feature. So again, there's a common theme here, right? Taking a hard problem and breaking it down and slicing and dicing it in many different ways. In this case, we're slicing it into the features, and we're distributing them around t-shirt sizes: small, medium, large, extra large. And again, we're going to go to historical data. Hopefully you have it, and we're going to multiply it out, and it's going to tell us roughly how long this thing's going to take. Again, it's pretty good at getting a rough estimate. So if you don't want to spend a lot of time on the estimate, this is a good way to give you some good feedback, right away. Another method that I use, but this is not really estimation, but it helps me inform my estimate or my pricing, is staff planning. So I have the plan or I have the estimate. I've taken the time to look at all the requirements, and I've mapped it out and I've broken it down and I've compared the projects, and I've got 1,500 hours, let's say, in a project. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and see how it's broken down by backend and front end developers, and I'm going to develop a plan. Like, based on this, I think it'll take X number of sprints to get this thing done. What this really lets us do is it really helps us tease out things that are going to happen on the project that affect pricing, maybe not the estimate, but they affect pricing. And we have to figure out like how we're going to accommodate this stuff, right? Is everybody going to ramp up on the project right away? Let's say you have a project that you think is going to use 7 developers. Are they really all going to start day one and all be fully allocated and usable at that point? Do you have certain things that you need to work on and you don't know when you're going to get them, right? So like, if you think in our case where we sometimes overlap conceive and build, I just have to make sure for the build portion of it that we're going to get the wireframes and comps and the requirements and things of that nature that we need. This also helps you account for the, I'll call it non-work. It's important, but it's not geared towards doing actual tasks, right? You think about your stand-ups, you think about sprint planning and sprint retrospectives and things of that nature. These are all important things, and we have to make sure we've accommodated for them. And ultimately, it helps me understand whether the plan is feasible or not. So if I have a deadline that I have to hit, like the staff plan will have that taken into consideration, and is it reasonable, right? The classic example would be if I have a project that is a 20-week project and I have 20 developers at my disposal. I don't think there's anyone here that thinks that we can get that project done in a week, right? And so like we need to look at that plan and we need to make sure that it's feasible. So we know what an estimate is, and we've seen different ways that we can estimate. So the last section is dedicated to the principles that I like to follow, things I like to think about when I'm going through this process. I said it before, but it bears repeating. We only know a project's cost or length with 100% certainty when it's complete. And this is important for a variety of reasons. For one, we need to somehow be able to convey our confidence level in the estimate to whoever's consuming the estimate, right? And there are a couple of different ways that people typically do this. One of the ways that people do this is that they will say, I am 75% confident in this estimate, or I'm 50% confident in this estimate. The percentage, like, confidence level, to me, it doesn't work. Like, I'm not really good at it because, frankly, I don't know what the difference between 85% confident and 90% confidence are. I typically like to use a range. If we think back to that cone of uncertainty that we saw earlier, right? I think this is a really good way to address the uncertainty that we run into, right? I can say, I think this project will, cost between $150,000 and $200,000, right? Or I can say the project will cost between, 100,000 or 1 million, right? The first indicates that I'm a lot more confident in the estimate than the last, right? And so this is the type of information that we really want to convey to the person that's consuming the estimate. The assumptions you made to get to an estimate are as important as the estimate. So what this is saying is we all assume some things when we're building out an estimate. And if we're doing that, we need to document them because the person consuming the estimate needs to understand what those things are, right? I think about when we build, our estimates for a Drupal project, the assumptions I'm putting in there are like, is this going to be self-hosted or is it going to be a PaaS hosted, platform? How many websites are we dealing with? Are we dealing with this as multilingual or not? Is there personalization involved? How many content types? How many taxonomies? How many components? How many page layouts? Like all these types of things, right? Because they all impact the estimate. So if you think about something like components, right? A lot of us are building component-based sites now. If I have as part of my estimate an assumption that we'll use 24 components, and we get into the build phase, and ultimately the client decides that they want 70 components, my estimate is no longer valid, right? We need to re-estimate there. We need to talk about it. Lots of things that we need to do. But ultimately, if the estimate assumes 24 components and you build 70 and you go over budget, like don't blame the guy that made the estimate, right? Because you've invalidated it. But it's really important that everybody understands what those assumptions are. When you estimate a project, don't assume the most qualified person in your team will do the work, right? A lot of times people that are doing the estimates are also like our 18 players, right? So, don't think about it in terms of how long it'll take you to do the project. Think about how long it'll take, somebody else in your team. Maybe it's a little bit more junior or more, maybe, a little less experienced with Drupal. A long time ago, I worked with a fellow, his name was Troy. And whenever Troy was asked how long it would take to do something, his first question was, do you want that in Troy hours or do you want that in regular developer hours? Now, conceded it is, I agree, but it really hit on a key point because Troy actually was a really good developer, and he actually was very, able to develop things a lot quicker than other people. And so, really what he's saying is that, look, like if someone else is going to do this, it's probably going to take you longer. And that's really important for us to capture in our estimates. This is easy for me to avoid because I live in Green Bay and I work remotely all the time, but don't give off the cuff estimates. Okay. If you're walking in the hallway and you meet at the water cooler, and your boss says, hey, how long will it take you to do this feature? The best answer you can give is, hey, let me get back to my desk and I'll get back to you, right? The reason I say that is oftentimes when we're put into that, put into a spot like that, whether it's in the meeting, in the hallway, whatever it is, we really quickly go through the estimation process. And estimation is hard, right? And we don't think about things. We don't think about the assumptions. We don't think about, what it all takes to do the solution. We're asked a question and we've been trained to respond quickly. And it's going to be bad for us. One, those estimates are going to be just bad. They're just not going to be very accurate. But two, and I'd say most importantly, is that the person that asked you that question is they think that's a commitment, right? They don't just think of it as an estimate. Hey Andy, how long is it going to take you to do that? I'll have that done by tomorrow. And they're going to say, okay, by 5 o'clock tomorrow, I'm going to have this thing, right? In the meantime, Andy's going back to his desk and he's like, oh crap, this CSS is a mess and my local environment's not spun up, and all these different things that I assumed were good when I made that estimate, and now they're not, and now it's hard to walk that back. So just be really careful when you're making these types of estimates. Don't imply a preciseness that your estimate is not providing. So what I mean by this is, let's say your boss runs into you in the hallway and asks you how long it's going to take to do a feature, and you've taken my advice and you say, you know what, let me get back to my desk, I'll get back to you. And you go back to your desk and you think about it and you break it down and you're like, all right, there's these 7 things that we have to do, and this one's going to take yada yada yada, blah blah blah, and you come up with the answer 28.75 days. Don't send that email, right? Don't say it's going to take 28.75 days, because the person on the other side is going to say, wow, like to 2 decimal places, amazing. He is super confident in this thing, right? And that's not really what you mean, right? You just mean that, hey, like I did this thing and this is what I came up with. So a better answer there is a month. I'll accept 4 weeks, but a month is better. If somebody asks you how long something's going to take and it takes, you calculated as 335 days, it's a year. right? One significant digit is really, really good. Because again, by giving a number as opposed to a range and then having a decimal point in that place, like, or, multiple significant digits is really going to, imply some preciseness that you're really not meaning. For a project to be accurate, the project leadership needs to exert project control. So what I mean by this is, especially if you are someone that works in the RFP space and you provide estimates for projects really early on, what we need for that estimate to come true is for the project leadership, whether it's technical leadership or the project management, to really drive to that budget, right? They really need to stay on top of the developers to make sure we're not spending lots of time for, things that we don't need to, that we're focused on the right things. They need to make sure that the client doesn't add requirements as we go along. They need to be diligent about that. Those things need to be added to the estimate or, addendums to the SOW, whatever it is. Ultimately, if no one's paying attention and no one's really steering, right? If we're just going through the day-to-day motions of let's have our stand-ups, let's do the tasks, let's move the cards through the Jira board. If no one's really keeping their eye on the big picture and making sure we're staying true to what the estimate was and the assumptions that were there, you're going to go over budget. You're going to go over timeline. You're going to go over budget. It's just going to happen. Steve McConnell, in the book that I'll mention later on, had a great quote, which is, a good estimate is an estimate that provides a clear enough view of the project reality to allow the project leadership to make good decisions about how to control the project to hit its targets. Again, like I think about a project a lot like, transatlantic navigation, right, in the boat. Like if you leave England and you're trying to go to New York and you don't keep your hand on the steering wheel and you don't constantly keep apprised of where you are in the ocean and, whereabouts you are, and you're making these tiny corrections, if you're not doing that, you're never going to get to New York City. Right. And so those are the types of things we're talking about. You got to make these tiny corrections as you're steering the ship to make sure you get to where you want to be. If something is hard to do it more often. Estimation is hard. So again, thinking back to that cone of uncertainty, right? We're constantly getting information and we're constantly getting more knowledge, and these things will help us like focus our estimate and tighten up the ranges as we go along. When we do work at Bounteous, certainly there's the estimate at the RFP range, but then as we go along, if we do discover and conceive, we write into our SOWs that we get to re-estimate, especially if we've had to commit to the build before we've done the discover and the conceive work, right? And even when you get into that build work, you want to keep estimating. Now, it may not be bottoms-up estimations every time, right? But you can use the t-shirt size, by feature. You can use count stuff. There's lots of different ways that you can give yourself information as you go along to make sure you're staying on track. Underestimating a project by a significant margin will cause it to be even later or more over budget than you'd expect. Prefer overestimates to underestimates. We can argue about maybe the last point, but the first part is really true, and I'm sure we've all been on these projects where the estimate was for like 200 hours, and it's really going to take you 400 hours, but you try to manage to the 200 hours, and it just blows things up, right? We don't do things well. We're under the pressure. The code that we write's shoddy, which makes maintaining even harder. The client is wondering, after 175 hours and the thing's not half done, like what's going on, right? And so now we're in more meetings and we're writing more reports and we're doing more analysis, doing all these different things that certainly, weren't considered in the estimate. And so it just taxes the team more and more and more. And it just is going to make you later and later and later. Now, a lot of times we significantly underestimate a project, not because we want to, but because there's pressure for, to get to a certain price. And so the thing to keep in mind is that estimation and pricing are two distinct things. And so we don't really want to confuse them, right? And so when I do an estimate for a project, I will say, hey, it's going to take, 2,000 hours, let's say, and it's going to cost, so much money. If we as a team don't like that idea, we want to win the work, there's some strategy behind that, whatever the deal is, like those are two distinct, those are two distinct conversations. We can price it differently. We can use a different rate card. We can, make an investment. There's lots of things that we can do on the pricing side. But ultimately, what we don't want to do is lower the estimate and the amount of time that we're going to take to do it. Because again, going back to the last slide, it's just going to make things harder and harder and harder. So if if you think it's 2,000 hours and you price it as though it was an 1,800-hour project, you really need to keep managing it as though it's a 2,000-hour project. Otherwise, bad things will happen. My last little principle is when you're doing estimation, we want to use multiple methods. I use two typically, and I compare the results. So whenever I estimate a project, I go through and I use comparison based, and and oftentimes I'll take that a step further and do comparison based with decomposition, and I'll get I'll see where that nets out, and then I might do something like counting, or I might use the t-shirt size feature thing. But ultimately, I want another point of data to make sure that I'm in good place. I think that this is a good estimate. Sometimes I'll also just pull in a colleague and I'll have them estimate it for me as well, and just see where we are. But ultimately, you don't want to count on the one estimate because there is a chance that you're wrong, and you want to spot that if you can. In summary, I pulled up 4 things from the talk. One is, it's really important to understand the question that's being asked, right? So a lot of times that's cost or length of time, but whatever the question's being asked, we want to make sure that we understand it when we do the estimate, to make sure that we give the proper perspective to whoever's asking that question. Remember the cone of uncertainty. Early on the project, things are very uncertain. Ranges should be pretty wide. As we get further and further along in the project, we can tighten up our ranges. You have multiple estimation approaches at your disposal. I've shown you the ones that I like to use. There are more, and you probably have more or different ones as well. Just know which ones you're comfortable with and when you're comfortable with them. And then lastly, prefer data to expert opinion. There are things that we're going to have to, do our expert opinion on because we just haven't done it before, and that's fine. But as much as we can, we want to prefer data because it takes the bias out of things. In preparation for this talk, along with many years of experience, I read a couple of books that are really good. Software Estimation Without Guessing by George Didwitty. That came out, I think, in December by Pragmatic Programmers, and I really love their books. So I recommend that one. And Software Estimation, Demystifying the Black Art by Steve McConnell is a really amazing book. And I really like all of McConnell's books that I've read. So I would recommend that one as well. Please provide feedback. Here is a link to my session, and also on the session you can find these slides. And thanks to the partners for captioning the sessions. It's great to have that. Contribution Day is still going on from 10 to 4. So please, give back to the community. And with that, I'll say thank you and ask if there are any questions.
Thanks, Chris. I don't see any questions quite yet, but please throw those in the Zoom chat. A lot of clapping going on, which is great.
Appreciate that.
The last slide again about Contribution Day. I'm not sure about that. Let's go to the next one. Thanks. I like to use ranges as well, but clients just tend to assume that higher range is real estimate. Any suggestions, Chris? This is from Luke.
That's a good question, Luke. I think, I mean, yeah, it's tough, right? Because frankly, I think it tends to be more the higher than the lower as well. But I think, what you can do is use some of your real data, right? I mean, if you've been tracking this stuff, you can even talk to them about, hey, like, we've done, a dozen of these projects, and most of the time we fall right in the middle of the range, or we fall, closer to the top end. So I think you can even, guide them with your words when it comes to that. But, if we're given ranges, and especially if they're not super wide, again, like McConnell, is suggested should be really, really wide, and I certainly can't get away with that range. So, typically my range is somewhere within that range to get us to be 90% correct. So, I'm okay with the, with that range, and them assuming it's at the top end. You can also talk about ways that you could mitigate it to make sure it's goes to the lower end of the range as well.
Another question is, I'm not sure I understand the difference between bottom up and decomposition. Can you clarify? This is from Andy Bloom.
Okay, Andy. I will try. I think the big difference to me is like the size of the chunks that I'm breaking them down into. So, comparison-based estimation, and when I'm doing decomposition, a lot of times it's pretty early in the process. And so I might say there are like, 12 content types, right? And I'll generalize between the content types. Or I might say there are 40 components, and I'll generalize to the 40 components about how long I think it's going to take. When it comes to like task decomposition, I'm saying there's a hero banner component, there's a quote component, there's a a location component, there's a slider component, there's a 3-up component. Like, I will break them down to very specific things, and then I'll estimate those very specific things or compare it to things that I've done before. So it's just a matter of the amount of detail and amount of time I'm spending on it, because the more time you spend on an estimate, to a certain degree, you'll get more accurate numbers. Giving infinite time, you're not going to get it right. Can tell you that. But a lot of times, depending on how close I need to be, is I'll decide whether I'll deep dive or not. Hopefully that helps out.
Great question here. Can you speak a bit to value-based pricing, estimating versus hourly?
Value-based pricing versus estimating, or estimating versus hourly. I'm not, maybe Steve, you can clarify that a little bit for me. I think, if we're talking about, value-based estimating versus hourly, I mean, typically I always do the hourly. I start with hourly, especially if I'm doing, new business work, to come up with the targets or whatever. Now, like, after I have an idea of what I think it's going to take. Let's see, there's a value around.
It's clarified here. Basically, there's a value around, let's say, a logo design, not hourly. What's it worth to a company? Because a logo might just take an hour to do.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think this gets to the heart of estimation is not quite the same as pricing. So I think, what I'm trying to do, especially what, in my position, is tell us how long I think things will take, but I think to your point there, ultimately, if there is value, if there's more value to the, to your client, then, the hour or so it takes you, right, you should be charging for that, so, what's it, you talk to a plumber, and, they they take the screwdriver and they make a couple of turns and they fix the problem, and it didn't take very long, right? And it's like, it takes me an hour to think, about what to do, and 30 seconds to do it. So I mean, part of that would be making sure, if you're in the estimate, you're capturing like what it all takes to do the actual work, and what goes into it. But just because you make an estimate and says this is how long it'll take doesn't mean that your pricing has to reflect just the hourly wage. It can certainly require, or represent value.
Another question from Beatrice. Sometimes devs can start to feel a lot of pressure and feel longer estimates somehow signify incompetence, which is so wrong. How do you maintain an encouraging environment for proper estimation if those feelings have crept in?
Wow, that's a great question. I think, part of it is just, having the understanding, having done this for a long time, that, you know, the typically developers are happy path people, and they typically underestimate everything anyway. And so, for me personally, if I talk to one of my devs and they tell me how long they think it's going to take, like, I just multiply it by a factor, because I just assume that it's, they're like me and they're going to underestimate it. I think the best thing you can do as a developer is just have transparency, because I think, when we have these types of challenges or conflicts or whatnot, it's because we just are misaligned on what the problem is and how to solve it. So I think when it comes to the developer, it's like, hey, like, these are the assumptions I've made, like, even if you have to be somewhat explicit about them. A good example is the thing early on where we talked about, with the developer, like, giving the example or giving the estimate the water cooler, right? When they get back to their desk and they've realized that all these things that are wrong, it's hard, like, those impact your estimate, and those impact how long it takes you to do it. And so it's, I think, to me, as a developer, it's just important to, like, articulate what's taking you, longer and longer to do. And it's just, again, I would encourage people to arrange things. So even if it's a task, because if you say something's gonna take 4 hours and it takes 5 hours, like, to me, that's, like, totally accurate. Like, I'm totally comfortable with that. But, I think, using some of these techniques can help, convey, right, the challenge you're facing, and convey, if I ask you to, do, like, build a content type, like, you've done that a number of times, assuming there's nothing weird about it. Like, we're pretty good at that, but asking you, to build, a custom module to do some integration with a custom system, like, that's going to be a lot rangier. And so, just, make sure that you essentially place that uncertainty into the estimate. And I like Dan's comment too, right? Which is, that, he usually views the estimate as being a time that people can check in to see with what the group wants to do. So, yeah, like, if something's taking longer than you expect, maybe it's time to regroup on the solution, right? Maybe we're making it harder than it should be, or maybe, Drupal just doesn't do this well, right? There's lots of reasons that they have nothing to do with, capabilities, and so we should talk about those things.
Any other questions? Feel free to use the Zoom chat to send them through. We have about 5 minutes left. Also, just to let everybody know, I put a link to the session to get the slides and to rate the session, so that'd be great. Another question, do you ever insert language in statements of work to unlock additional hours when a client might push a project stage beyond the estimate? I've been squeamish to do this since it presents uncertainty at the stage level.
I mean, so we do typically try to cover ourselves with statements of work. Um, one of the ways we do it is we like to work by time and materials, right? And like you get which you have, if we take this much time, you're going to pay this much price. But we can't always do that. The other thing that we can do, especially in our types of projects, where we're going to go through like a couple of different phases, is we like reserve the right. Like if we have to commit to the build before we know all this stuff, then we write into the SOW like we get to re-estimate. So if the client comes to us and says, we want you to the statement of work to cover the conceive and the build, then we say we get to come back after the conceive is done and we've had a chance to deep dive into the requirements and build out the architecture and go through all the the XD exercises. um, you know uh, we get to come back to this estimate and make sure we do it. We also just suggest like that they have some kind of contingency, and our contingencies typically vary based on essentially how confident we are in the project and what we've done. So the answer is yes. We we do this because ultimately, you know, you really you need to protect yourself, but you also need to protect the client too, right? Which is why I prefer like time and material projects as opposed to fixed bid. Because if it's a fixed bid, like I'm going to jack that price up because I have to protect myself on the downside. With time and material, it's to me it's more of a joint assumption of risk based on what's going to happen in the project.
Another question from Luke. I was going to ask about general suggestions for updating clients on estimates. Besides being proactive rather than reactive, any other suggestions?
I think it's that. I think it's being proactive. I think it's being transparent. Like as you do this, I don't and we don't do estimates, and re-estimates like every week, but you've got a good sense as to where things are, right? And if we've had a couple of bad sprints in a row, I probably want to reevaluate it, and we use, weekly communications with our clients. And we talk about, budget and timeline and, red, yellow, green, like where they sit. But I think, you know, that's the best thing that you can do is just be open and honest and transparent with the communications, because the last thing you want to do, if you're in the build and you've run into some problems, is surprise the client. Like you don't want everything to be green for like 4 months and then all of a sudden be red the next week. Like that's a problem. And Dan's got a nice suggestion where he does weekly or every 2 week check-ins with timelines, and they use Gantt charts. So yeah, I think it's a similar message. Like have data, show it to people, right? Even if you're constantly doing re-estimation, you have an idea of how you're burning down compared to what you've projected, and then make sure that you're just communicating that with the clients.
Another suggestion, Chris, I'll give is demos to the client as you go to demonstrate progress. That really helps give them an idea of where it is. And one big red flag that I've had on projects is when you start canceling demos because it's not demonstratable progress, is when things start taking a turn around a corner that you might not come back. So when you have those scheduled demos and people say, let's cancel this week's demo because we don't have much to show, and then you do it 2 weeks in a row, you have to start asking some hard questions. Those have come out
Take
of
your
retros.
lumps. Yep, take your lumps. I mean, because that's what's going to tell them, hey, like the project isn't where it's not going as well as we want. Absolutely. And also is the team has to like internalize that, like, hey, like we missed this commitment. Like, what do we need to do to make sure we don't miss it again? Absolutely.
Thanks so much. We can take this talk to the hallway. I'm going to put in the channel the Zoom for the hallway room. but I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and thanks, Chris, for a great talk. And hopefully
Thank
everybody
you.
can stick around for some more sessions in the afternoon. Thanks.